Beyond the Gates spoilers for next week, September 812, 2025, teased that Kat feels the first small, catastrophic shift as soon as she turns the corner of Dupree's garden and sees them, Eva and Thomas leaning close under the string lights, their heads bent over something as mundane as a cracked vinyl record cover or as intimate as a private joke. The scene is simple and ordinary and meaningless. Rationally, it's the way Thomas's hand rests near Eva's that digs into Kat's sternum like a splinter. The air smells of cut grass and lemon oil from the patio table where someone had cleaned the glass earlier. In that late summer twilight, the scene has the soft glow of a Polaroid warm, gilded, the edges slightly blurred, but it cuts Kat cleanly like a piece of glass. She had been looking for Chelsea for 3 days by then, and the search had stripped her of a patient, methodical steadiness she didn't know she possessed. Every small disappointment, an empty locker at the jazz club, a voicemail with only static, had tightened her in a way that made ordinary slights feel like betrayals. Seeing Thomas with Eva, laughing with the easy pity of people who recognize the same jokes, felt like such a betrayal, even though it also needed saying Thomas and Kat were still together. They were the kind of couple who had been together long enough to have habits that saved them in the small ways and wore them down in the big ways. Kat and Thomas loved each other in the fractured, sometimes sharp way that people who know each other's worst traits do, protective but impatient, loyal but quick to scold. Love in their house was measured in refrigerator magnets sparing festival dates and in the shorthand names of old fights. Across from the garden scene, Kat replayed her relationship with Thomas like a film reel on slow motion. There were countless little lessons that had accrued: Thomas's tendency to soothe when he wanted to avoid conflict, his awkward attempts at reparations after he crossed boundaries he thought he might have overstepped. Kat remembered the argument about the kitchen sink, how Thomas left dishes that made her teeth ache with irritation, and she in turn folded into a coldness that could last for days. She remembered the funeral where he held her tight and she resented, later, that he had laughed at a funeral anecdote before she had the space to. Those moments, petty and seismic both, had made her notice the mismatch between comfortable and compatible. There were things they fit together for and routines, the fact they both liked early morning coffee, but as she looked at Thomas with Eva, she felt the sudden clarity that compatibility and love were not the same thing. Thomas, unaware of the tightness in her stomach, reached for Eva's hand to point something out in the sleeve. Their fingers brushed, and Kat noticed the way Eva did not withdraw, the familiar tilt of her head that mirrored Thomas's, the laugh that came easily. They were not doing anything erotic, they were doing something more dangerous in its innocence. A shared reference, a small private memory. Thomas and Eva, as Kat watched, seemed to fit into one another's silence the way two puzzle pieces do, gentler, less defensive, more forgiving than Kat had seen him be with her in the last restless months. It was the kind of comfort that is difficult to name and impossible to give back once seen. Kat's search for Chelsea had become a lens through which every minor indignity became maximal. Chelsea, her cousin, was 22, bright, and always capable of half-astonishing kindnesses that made people think she had been softened by some private secret of generosity. Her disappearance was a bruise spreading through the family, subtle at first, then diffuse. People tried to be cheerful in the wrong places, to fill the empty chair with casseroles and platitudes, but the space Chelsea left was more than a physical absence. It was a knot of questions. Where had she last been seen, and with whom? Had she left with money, elated, impulsive, or had someone taken advantage of a moment when she was trusting? Kat chased text messages like breadcrumbs. She replayed the last conversation they had over coffee where Chelsea had looked at Kat and said, almost offhand, "I'm fine," the kind of statement that carries within it either self-assurance or a lie so practiced it begins to feel true. Chelsea's sudden, inexplicable decision to do something with her life, whatever it was, made Kat think of Allison. Allison, with her sandpaper voice and unself-conscious charm, had always had a way of making hard arguments seem like confessions. She was the sort of person who, when she spoke, made people rearrange their priorities without knowing they'd moved. Kat wondered whether Allison had manipulated Chelsea, whether a gentle suggestion over coffee had become a pressure against a closed door. The idea that Allison might threaten or intimidate Chelsea was grotesque to Kat, who had always thought of Allison as someone who could smooth out the worst parts of a crisis with the right wine and the right anecdote. But games of influence are subtle. A suggestion becomes a mandate by virtue of repetition. "You're fine, you can handle it" morphs into "don't tell anyone." Allison could have told Chelsea to say she was okay, to lie for the sake of preserving appearances, or she could have told her to go somewhere specific and made that goading sound like support. The more Kat considered it, the more plausible the idea was that Allison, far from being a helper, might have been a silencer. That possibility, Allison as manipulator, hung over Kat like damp linen. She tried to imagine Allison's logic, the fear of scandal, the desire to close the narrative before it damaged the fragile social order Allison cultivated. Allison was very good at holding together the thin web of reputations in the neighborhood. She could be merciless in the name of civil order. If Chelsea had been reckless, Allison's instincts would be to contain rather than to rescue. Kat scoured social media for tags and for the small, telltale geotags that might show Chelsea's last known places. She found a few half photos, a blurred skyline, a coffee cup at dusk. Nothing explicit. Nothing that said "I am here." While Kat's heart was breaking in small glass shards over a man who laughed with another woman, other relationships in the town were reconfiguring in ways that felt both tender and seismically unfair. Danny and Bill, once the kind of exes who had glazed over each other's poor jokes like they were smoothing frost off an old window, were being drawn back to one another by the magnetism of worry. Chelsea's absence had become a shared project that required both of them to record details, to triangulate friend circles, and to resume a kind of teamwork that had atrophied under the weight of divorce. They spent long nights at each other's houses going through phone records, watching CCTV footage grainily capture suits of passing strangers. There were moments of accidental tenderness, Bill ironing Danny's shirt with a concentration ordinarily reserved for engine parts, Danny, in return, making coffee for Bill at dawn because she knew how he liked the milk heated. They spoke in that stripped language of co-parents who had once promised each other permanency but got something different, a mutual imperative to keep their child safe. In the process of searching, the old affection too stubborn to die but too fumbling to be called love without qualifiers softened into something like cooperation, and then, on some nights when the house settled and the clocks seemed to exhale, something warmer. Haley watched them from the periphery with a determination sharpened by jealousy. She had plans, mechanical, sensual, the type of plot that felt, to her, like gathering the right tools for a repair job. Haley's scheme to seduce Bill and claw him back into her life was not an impulsive move, it was rehearsed. A series of steps that included leaning against his workshop counter in a dress that had pockets deep enough for both her keys and some purposeful ambiguity. She knew Bill's weaknesses, the way his eyes softened around old jokes, the precise timbre of his laugh when he felt understood, the thin places in him that grief had left unguarded. She rehearsed the lines she would use, the half-confessions, the stories that would make him feel seen. Haley imagined a scene that felt cinematic. A slow dance at a neighbor's backyard party, an accidental hand on the small of his back, a kiss that felt like reclaiming something she believed was always hers. Yet Bill was not forgetful. The disappearance of a daughter did not allow him many frivolities. Fatherhood had carved a new architecture into him, one of constant alertness, of a hunger for facts rather than flirtation. When Haley leaned into the doorway of his shop and smiled, Bill smiled back with the exhaustion of someone whose nights were spent drafting lists of possible suspects. He listened politely to her talk of work and summer plans, but his answers were clipped and full of numbers, times, locations, faces to call. It was not cruelty. He could not allow himself the luxury of starting something new while an old alarm bell still rang. Haley's plan to pull him from Danny by means of seduction faltered because, in the end, Bill's priorities were not hers to redirect. She left the conversation with a bruise on her pride and a little more bitterness toward the universe. Haley's disappointment tripled, though, and made the air around her for a while taste of petty schemes. She tried again, The next time more public, a suggested outing that would just be to get his mind off things. Bill, reasonable and blunt, declined. Haley's disappointment turned to something else in ugly, private resentment that she stewed over in clinics of late-night television and in the dry pages of self-help books. She began to plot not with finesse but with the restless desperation of someone used to having their way. The more she failed, the less she cared to fail gracefully. Her eyes hardened not at Bill but at the idea that she was being left behind as other people. Danny, Kat, Thomas adjusted to the new, brittle reality of Chelsea's absence in ways she hadn't intended to. Inside the Dupree house, the arrival of Leslie was a storm that most people saw coming but underestimated. Leslie had always been the kind of person whose volume did not come from her voice but from the force with which she insisted on being noticed. She had manners that were performative, clapping like she had conquered something every time someone laughed, and a habit of turning small slights into indignant sermons. She showed up with a handbag full of opinions and a mouth that would shape each opinion into a weapon. At a time when the household needed steadiness, Leslie brought friction. She made biting remarks about Anita's parenting choices and then, with the same breath, criticized Anita's kids for being too loud at the wrong times. Her remarks came like stones thrown into a shallow pond, small, intentional splashes that unnerved everything nearby. Eva, with a sense of social negotiation honed through years of balancing delicate alliances, stepped in to mitigate. She had grown adept at smoothing her mother's abrasive edges, turning their social currency into something less like a blunt instrument and more like a tool for keeping the peace. She told Leslie, quietly and firmly, that now was not the time to prod at other people's wounds. "We can be strong without being cruel," Eva said once, in a voice that tried to bridge the gap between patient daughter and disappointed witness. Leslie sneered at the suggestion as if pity were a kind of comedic insult rather than a necessary kindness. But Eva had learned the cost of her mother's provocations, how quickly an offhand comment could cascade into social exile. Eva, haunted by the fear of being disliked and awkward, social fear with its own sharp edge, intervened not from morality but from self-preservation. She did not want her friends or neighbors to think her complicit in Leslie's cruelty. She did not want to inherit that reputation. The tension rose quietly in the kitchen with small exchanges, an accusation disguised as advice, a rebuke made to look like concern. Leslie pushed until someone had to say enough, and when that someone was Anita, the confrontation lost its theatricality and achieved a pitiless clarity. Anita, who had been pulled into 1,000 domestic battles and held her ground through them by the grit of someone who had learned to stand for the things that mattered, told Leslie to leave. The eviction was not loud, it was a matter-of-fact expulsion, the way someone might remove a broken appliance from the line. Leslie stormed out with her good manners fraying, and Eva watched the door close after her mother with a strange, nearly guilty relief. Relief because the house no longer vibrated with her mother's abrasive voice, guilty because expelling Leslie felt like a betrayal, like abandoning a creature who could not be reasoned with. But Eva's greater fear of being dragged into a circle of social animosity she had not chosen kept her from calling her mother back. Away from the neighborhood's interpersonal jagged edges, other tectonic plates were shifting. Martin, a man with a history of reckless bravado, had paused on the brink of a new miscalculation and watched Smitty's face for approval. Smitty had once been furious with him for reasons that had to do with money gone missing, deals cut too close to the bone, and the way Martin's loyalties seemed to bend toward quick wins rather than steady, communal prosperity. Yet time had its softening effect even on betrayal. Smitty had begun to thaw. There had been a long conversation in the late hours, where Martin described his new financial entanglement with Joey, a dangerous handshake that might bring in the cash they needed but at a cost to their reputations and safety. "I can make this right," Martin said at one point, reaching across the kitchen table like a supplicant. Smitty's face was unreadable, a mask that had been carved and recarved over many years. Forgiveness was not a single moment for him. It was a ledger that he kept open with the austere hand of someone who had seen too many people default on promises. Smitty's potential forgiveness for Martin was a fragile accord, one predicated on the hope that Martin would not repeat the same errors. The problem was Joey. Joey was, in every quiet way, A rumor-made person's slick charm, a smile that did not reach the eyes, the kind of man who saw rules as polite suggestions. He moved through the town with the confidence of someone who believed he was indispensable. The deal Martin considered with Joey was attractive because it promised quick cash, the kind of solution to pressing problems that could bail a person out of deep worry. Smitty's warning was steady and plain: do not make the same mistake twice. The lender remained open, but only if Martin kept his side clean. Vanessa's situation, by contrast, was already a ruin. Hidden relationships have a tendency to erupt when least convenient, and one of Doug's least convenient times was when his hands were full of the cold, raw panic that came with a missing child. He was the sort of husband who tried to compartmentalize his grief into mechanical tasks: check the CCTV, call the last people seen with Chelsea, walk the park in the precise arcs that might catch a glimpse of someone leaving, and he did not like surprises. So when he walked into his house and found Vanessa with Joey, a private intimacy shared between them like a crime scene made of soft sheets rather than shards, the moment detonated with the potency of everything he could no longer hold in check. Vanessa froze when Doug's key turned. There is a peculiar, flaring shame that sears a person when they are caught in their own betrayal. It buoys and then collapses them into smallness. Joey slipped away like someone who had practiced his exits, but the damage of being seen had already been done. Doug's anger was not the kind that flared like a match and went out. It was the slow, inexorable heat of something that had been simmering below the surface. He did not explode into immediate violence. Instead, he stood very still, his body a taut wire. Vanessa's attempts to explain were muffled by the numbness that articulates itself as stammering apologies. Doug's fury took on a surreal quality because, layered beneath it, was the burning coal of fear for his daughter. What partner could protect a child when their trust had been fractured so fundamentally? Joey's audacity in the affair, the way he had crossed lines not merely of desire but of tactical advantage, made Doug's blood colder than his anger. Joey was someone who should have been an enemy across the street, not an interloper bedding his wife. The implications were ugly. What had Joey been trying to gain by sleeping with Vanessa? Was it blackmail, leverage, or a transaction more personal and petty? The revelation placed Vanessa in a humiliating light, not just for herself but for the community. Small towns have long memories, and the social ledger would balance itself in gossip and isolation. Doug's fury, meanwhile, laid the groundwork for something more dangerous than a marital fight. Men who are betrayed often look for places to direct their hurt, and in that hurt there is a capacity for retribution that can eclipse reason. Doug, nursing his fear for Chelsea and his horror at Vanessa's betrayal, became a man with an internal equation to solve: how to protect his child while also reconciling the fact that his home, the last safe place he could imagine, had been violated in the simplest, most human ways. Every one of these private disasters: Kat's mounting jealousy, Danny and Bill's rekindled coalition, Haley's frustrated seduction, Leslie's ejection, Martin's shaky bargains, Vanessa's exposure, folded like tributaries into a river that smelled of stormwater. The town held its breath in small, domestic ways: a neighbor bringing soup, an aunt leaving a note with a phone number of someone who works for the police. The optics of the crisis made certain alliances stronger and others brittle. People who had been polite acquaintances turned into investigators. Neighbors who had once kept their grievances to themselves now offered up information like currency. The missing person poster with Chelsea's face was a small paper sun around which people orbited, each in their own eccentric elliptical path. Kat was caught in the middle of an emergent danger. She had an ache for Thomas, a suspicion of his warmth with Eva, and an obsession with answers about Chelsea. Her emotional calculus was messy as she tried to weigh the significance of what she had seen. Was Thomas's ease with Eva innocent, or did it mark the beginning of a change that would make their own tension intolerable? Kat found herself analyzing the grammar of their quiet. How Thomas sighed at the same time Eva raised her eyebrows, how their laughter overlapped perfectly. She wanted to confront Thomas, to demand an explanation, but Chelsea's absence taught restraint. A blow-up now might scatter the network of people who could help. Kat held back the words that would have been spoken in the heat of earlier months and instead asked herself a more vulnerable question: Am I holding on to a version of Thomas that no longer exists? She spent one midnight alone on the Dupree porch, feeling the low hum of the neighborhood like a distant engine. The stars were smeared by city haze, the radio behind the door hummed with a lyric she could not quite catch. Her phone buzzed, an anonymous tip perhaps, or someone's misfired joke, and momentarily she considered what matters most, a relationship that had become a kind of quarried agreement, or a missing cousin whose absence might be the hinge on which the rest of the town turned. She leaned back in the chair and allowed herself a rare clarity. Relationships, she thought, are made up of more than brief intimacies. A touch might betray, but a pattern confirms. And yet the scene in the garden did not leave her. It crept into her dreams like a recurring melody. In those dreams it was not only Thomas who was warm beside another, it was every small thing that had been denied to her. Sureness, quiet laughter without edge, the sense of being chosen without argument. The dream ended every time with her at a gate ironwork, ornate, the sort of object that looked as if it promised thresholds, and Kat waking with her hand on a doorknob, as if she had meant to leave. The metaphor of the gate would become, later, richer than any of them expected. For now, it was an image that sat like a promise and an accusation both. Things were shifting, thresholds were being crossed, and someone, perhaps many someones, would have to decide what to leave behind and what to carry forward. At dusk on the fourth day of Chelsea's absence a single message arrived that neither comforted nor consoled. It was a clip of movement, a brief, grainy piece of video shot from the back of a nightclub, innocuous and menacing for the same reasons. A laughing figure with Chelsea's hair turned in the wrong light toward the camera for a fraction of a second before disappearing into a crowd. The video was not proof. It was not even a lead that could be verified. But it was motion in a landscape of stillness, and in that way it was the most dangerous thing of all. It suggested someone had the power of choice. Someone was making decisions about her cousin's presence and absence. Kat watched the clip once, twice, 10 times. Her chest tightened until she could not breathe. She called Thomas and then hurled her phone onto the couch when it went straight to voicemail. She wanted to say, "Please explain." Instead she sat and counted the odd small sounds of a house that had become too large. Outside, across the street, lights went out in the houses like the slow blinking of a spine. People retreated to kitchens and to beds with the solemnity of sleep and of schemes unmade. The town had become a quiet conspiracy of people pretending not to notice the fault lines in their lives. But fault lines have a way of becoming trenches, and someone, somewhere, would soon decide to step into one.